Hi, it's Jonathan. Another incredible lesson today. I was walking out in the woods again, in a state of contemplation. All the things kind of whirling around in my mind. The ego trying to follow its own illusion. I was walking and I was thinking about, well, what is this then? How do you overcome all of the challenges here? And then it infused into me what is occurring with me metaphorically. It said, your personality as it is right now can't really help anybody. It thinks it can, but it can't. You see, whenever I have been in a state of dialogue or interaction, spontaneous interaction that has affected people, it said, from its point of view, that was me. When your ego was overcome and I was speaking through it, that's when you become very piercing with truth, because you're kind of along for the ride, as is your design. Well, look how much you enjoy when the Spirit speaks through you, Jonathan, that type of thing. That's because you're designed specifically to enjoy love, to enjoy being guided by the Creator of everything. That's your design. That's why nothing gives you more pleasure than when something like that happens. For example, I recently took a trip through the Bible Belt, and I'll describe what happened on that trip later. But I found myself down in Florida. I was guided to go into a strip club. And you're thinking, yeah, I'm sure you were guided, Jonathan. But it's not what you think. I like to be around those people. For some reason, they're the ones that I know are being held down. And that doesn't mean that I go in there with my personality and say, oh, you're more held down than I am. I'm better than you. No, it's quite the opposite. I went in and immediately went way in the back corner. Some of the girls came up and wanted me to tip them, and I made them understand that's not what I want to do. And they would sit down and talk to me, and we talked a lot about spirit, a lot about what's going on in the country and all kinds of things. And I was sitting there, and then it happened. You see why you're led to do things. And in comes this girl, who apparently had stripped there before. And they wouldn't let her strip that night for whatever reason. There was some conflict, and so they wouldn't let her ask for tips. They wouldn't let her strip or dance or anything. So she sat down next to me, and we started talking. She was pretty and all that. Jonathan's ego would take notice of that. And so the law of attraction, the magnetic coupling of energies of the minds, the egos, took place, and her base chakra became active, her root chakra, her sex energy. And I could feel it. She started to bat her eyes at me and tell me how she's married, but occasionally her husband lets her play, that type of thing. The whole temptation. Of course, there was an entity attached to her. And I started to feel it strongly, and then I had to tell her, I said, I feel your base chakra, your root chakra. I can feel the energy. I said, I'm going to turn that off, okay? And she looked at me. She said, no, you're not. I said, give me your hands. So I held her hands. And then what I tried to do was focus my energy, like an energy worker would do, to turn off her base chakra. And I sat there for 30 seconds, focusing really hard with the mind, to try to manipulate her energy and bring it into, quote, balance. Then I let go after 30 seconds with this confident look on my face. I said, how do you feel now? She said, the same, and laughed. She said, I'm still horny. I'm like, oh yeah. The same thing that happened with that scenario with the girl who had cancer, right? And then the information started coming in my head via the Spirit. She was molested. I said, were you molested as a child? Right out of the blue. Her expression changed. She said, yeah. Your father, right? Yeah. Your husband lets you play, huh? And lets you strip? Give me your hands again. And this time, I wasn't trying to manipulate energy. I loved her. Inside, I loved what was in her. It wasn't her fault. The whole thing isn't her fault. The fact that she's a stripper there, under the control of entities, magnetically coupled to an abusive husband, a using husband, it's not her fault. And I loved the Spirit in her. Suddenly, she let go of my hands, gasped, and said, oh my God, that worked. She got off her stool, walked about 5 feet, collapsed, fell against the wall. She had to sit there for a moment. What happened? She was possessed by an entity. And I started loving her spirit to the point, like jump-starting a car, that it started to rise inside of her and challenge the entity's control, which created that visceral, that somatic symptom of dizziness and illness, a really challenging feeling inside of her own mind. She came back to the stool and had a different point of view. And then I explained to her. And she was under the command of love at that point, as was I. It wasn't Jonathan's mind explaining life to her, because Jonathan's mind doesn't know anything. Jonathan's mind experiences these things. And at the end of that, I just said, you're loved. And I know the Spirit will take it from there. Because I loved her. And love sustains. And I will continue to do so. I don't have to be in her presence. See, people think prayer, they've been manipulated by this pagan religion system. To think that prayer means you have to sit there and mouth words in your head. To think of linear language in your mind. That's not what prayer is. Prayer. God already knows what you need. The Spirit already knows what you need. It isn't about you having to define it for the Spirit. It already knows. So there's only one thing you can do. Love the creative Spirit. I was taught that today in the woods with, it explained what's happening to me. You know the concept that mind control agents use? They talk about creating altars in your mind. It said that's kind of what's happening to me. The Spirit has created an altar of Jonathan that is untouchable. And when it flips forward, it has the command of the Spirit. But it's not an altar like mind control in that it's separate from other parts of me, that when it comes forward and goes back that I forget all about it. No, this one is wired into every altar of Jonathan, every part of Jonathan. And the way it put it in my mind was like, because, see, Jonathan, you're thinking of it incorrectly. You hear the words of Christ where he said, soon you will all be as me. Well, what makes you think that is just people? If there are many yous, many versions of your personality, like everybody, inside your own head, then if you are now penetrated by Spirit, then